Hey everyone, welcome to Nerding IO. I'm JD, and today what we're going to be going through is Hume AI and the ability to connect to a custom model. So what we're going to be doing is looking at how to set this up with WebSockets. We'll be using LangChain, and then we're also going to be looking at the trace itself in LangSmith. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at Hume again, and we're just going to dive right into some of their documentation. We're actually going to be using the custom language model. This is not a custom model. It means that we're going to be connecting to a different LLM. And so they have this example repository that we're going to go through, and then we're going to trace it. But I thought it was interesting to look at some of the reasons that we might want to use a custom LLM. So there's the ability to kind of control the advanced conversation steering. So you can think about that with when you have control and you're using something like LangChain and be able to be more deterministic about your workflow. By programming that, it gives you more flexibility on controlling the steering, like the conversation itself. You can adhere to a stricter regulatory compliance, right? To make sure that you have your moderation or any other guardrails that you need to put in place. You can have better context awareness. The real-time access, we can actually do this in their tools and search. But this other one is also really huge, right? If we want to be able to access our RAG, then there's a couple different ways that we can do this, where either we're using their tooling or we can actually implement a LLM that has the ability to have the RAG in place. And so this is just kind of a workflow of how we're going to be doing this, because it requires, as you can see here, the custom model needs a socket connection. And so this socket connection is going to be how we actually hit the model, and then we're using it to actually structure our payloads and send it back to Hume. So let's kind of dive into what that means. First, if we go to their example repository, we're going to pull that down. So we've actually used this before. If you've seen it in the other videos, they have like the function calling and things like that. We're actually going to use this custom language model. And what's different about this is it's using a handful of things. So we're actually going to be using Python, we'll use Poetry, Unicorn, and then ngrok. Ngrok is how we're actually going to make the connection to our local machine, and then of course LangChain for our AI flow. So a couple of things to note is that in order to get Poetry up and running, the first thing that you're going to need to do, you can see here I have an instance running, and so you're going to want to do Poetry shell to get your instance started. So I've already activated my environment, and then you need to do Poetry install to get everything that they have. Again, I already have the dependencies in place. That's one thing that I noticed that wasn't in the setup, where it actually talks about starting the connection. So now that we have this, we can actually go ahead and do our connection. So we're going to go to Poetry, and we'll run this. But before we even do this, another thing we want to do is set up our environment variables. So we're going to go ahead and do that as well. So if we jump over to the code, the first thing we want to see is that we're going to use the SERP API. We need an OpenAI key, and then we want to put in our information for tracing. This is specifically if we're using LangSmith, which comes out of the box with LangChain, so you can just set up these environment variables and get off and running. The reason that we need these two is because if we look at our file in our agent specifically, we have that we are using this tool and we're actually connecting to OpenAI. Now, we could actually change this so that it could be any LLM that we wanted to connect to, whether that's like Claude or Mistral or whatever, or even an OpenAI compatibility model. This is also where we could do a lot of like the RAG instances and any kind of information that we want to connect to. So let's go ahead and get those variables. Again, we're using SERP as the search tool to call out, and then we're using OpenAI as the tool to get our LLM. So if we now try this, we're going to get up and running. We have no problems here. The other thing that we're going to need to do is use ngrok. So ngrok is actually a tool that allows you to basically like proxy into your local machine. You might have used it for like Stripe or something. Blow this up a little bit. But the way what we're going to do now is actually run ngrok. And so this means that this URL is actually pointing to our local web interface here. And you can't actually see it, but instead of this web interface, it would be the local host of 8,000. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're actually going to go into our configuration. See again, right here, we have our ngrok instance. So next it's telling us to go into our voice configuration in order to create a socket. So if we go directly into a configuration in Hume, we can just use an old one, or you can create a new one. If you're creating a new one, I just went with default system, because you're going to have to, once you get to this stage, you're going to have to change it to the custom language model. And so now what we have to do is we have to put in our WebSocket. And so in order to do that, if you look at the instructions, it's telling you that you want to have the WebSocket of your custom language model, which sits here, right? And so what we'll do is we'll pull that information from ngrok. So we just need this, and we'll go into our custom model and we'll do a WebSocket protocol and point it there, and then we have to do /LLM. And the reason we have to do /LLM is because we need, where's the save? If we look at our code base and we go in here to our main, which is how we're actually launching this application, it's looking for this WebSocket endpoint. It's not looking for HTTP. So if we were to go to our local, it's going to show not found. And that's because even though we're running our local host on port 8000, there's no endpoint that allows us to hit it. So we can't hit like LLM, nothing would show up. But in our WebSocket, it will. And so what this WebSocket is doing is once it accepts a connection, it's actually pulling in this agent, and then it's starting a stream. So as long as information is coming back from this socket, we'll be getting the responses and sending it text. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at our agent and just kind of see a couple of things. So again, all of this is pulling in LangChain. So this is how we're actually going to be able to trace. This is how we're actually going to be able to use our agent. And down here we have our tool. Again, this is no different than function calling or tool calling. And we have our prompt, which we're pulling from a template repository or the hub. And then we're using our OpenAI LLM. We're creating our JSON chat. And then these functions down here are actually explaining the porosity and the Hume message structure, right? Because it's a little bit different than the structure of like an OpenAI compatibility schema. And then we're going to be doing our responses. It'll give us our history and even the number of words. So this is just a pretty simple way of showing how it's going to respond back with information. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to go in and test our model. So let's double check that this because I was playing with this earlier, is the same here. And we'll go ahead and save, because you can do it in both places. And let's go ahead and give this a shot. So we're going to go ahead and start a call. Real quick, everyone, if you haven't already, please remember to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And with that, let's get back to it. Cool. So now we're just going to go ahead and start our call. Hey, I'm just testing our Langsmith tracing with Hume AI.
Hey. Hello, I'm here to help with any questions or tasks you have. Please feel free to ask anything you'd like assistance with.
Cool, so I've muted myself, and now we're going to actually take a look at the chain. So we can actually see the information that's coming back here, where it's saying that if there's any questions, we can ask it. And so it's here to help. So let's go ahead and just ask another question. Can you get me information about Langsmith?
Sure.
As we can see, it
Linksmith
messed
is
up
an all-in-one
the name
developer
there.
platform for every
But
step of the LLM-powered application lifecycle. It provides tools for debugging and updating business information. Additionally, it's associated with music.
And so now what we can see is that all this information is starting to come back, right? Again, it messed up the name there, but it knew, even though the spelling was wrong, to go out and find Langsmith here and find information around that. So that's we're kind of looking at like the tracing here, and so now what we're going to do is actually go into Langsmith and see the results that we got. So remember, if you look at the example, we have this Hume custom language model. So if we go into Langsmith, we have our project here. There's multiple run counts from some of the testing. And what's interesting is in these executions, it is telling you the emotions associated with the input as well as the output. So here's all of the information that's going to OpenAI. Here's where it's actually doing the JSON agent and parsing that into what would then go into search. This is where it's getting information around what it thinks Langsmith is. And then this is the actual response that we're getting. And again, it is showing the emotion in the responses. So even though, and that's because we're mashing it together. So as it's speaking, it's not saying slightly interested. It's just associating that in the transcript to display emotion. And that was something that I thought was really interesting, is that through this agent and the right here, this is where it's like joining all of the emotions that are being felt from the information that's coming back from Hughes, again, in our transcript. It's just really interesting to be able to, if you wanted to annotate on any of that information or do some sort of data set of any of your findings, since you are using a custom LLM, this would be a really interesting way to kind of associate that with it. Cool. And so that was the biggest thing about being able to use a custom model, is that it's connecting through a WebSocket. So whatever you're deploying this to would need to be a WebSocket instance. All right, that's it for us today, everyone. What we learned was how to actually build and connect a config to a custom model. In this instance, it's running locally on our and connecting through WebSockets and ngrok. We also were able to trace that information back through LangChain and Langsmith. And with that, happy nerding.